Silence has a psychology of its own. It is not empty, it is not neutral. Silence is a presence, and when it arrives suddenly, without warning, it leaves behind questions that burrow deep into the human mind. In the world of true crime, the most disturbing cases are not always the loud ones, not the ones filled with chaos or spectacle. The most unsettling stories begin quietly, almost politely, with absence. A phone that never rings again, a door that is never opened, a family that simply stops existing. This is Dark Psyche Case Files. And this is the case of the McStay family. The human brain is wired to search for patterns. When something does not fit, we feel discomfort. When a pattern breaks entirely, we feel fear. That fear grows strongest when what disappears is not a person, but an entire family, parents, children, routines, laughter, arguments, plans for tomorrow, all gone at once, leaving no explanation behind. In early February of the year 2010, the McStay family vanished from their home in Fallbrook, California. There was no note, no goodbye, no sign of a struggle, no confirmed final sighting, just a house that felt abandoned in the middle of an ordinary life. Joseph McStay was a businessman, not famous, not wealthy in the way headlines like to exaggerate, but ambitious, driven. He ran a small company that designed and sold custom decorative fountains. It was the kind of business that required creativity, persistence, and trust. Trust in clients, trust in partners, trust in people. His wife, Summer McStay, was a devoted mother. Friends described her as hands-on, protective, deeply connected to her children. Her life revolved around her family. The boys, Gianni and Joseph Jr., were young, energetic, and inseparable. They were at ages where routines matter, bedtimes matter, comfort matters. Families like this do not disappear easily. Which is why, when the McStays stopped responding to messages, something felt wrong. At first, the concern came quietly. A relative noticed that Joseph was not returning calls. Emails went unanswered. Days passed, then weeks. Eventually, worry hardened into alarm. A welfare check was requested. When investigators entered the McStay home, they found a scene that did not scream danger, but whispered abandonment. Food had been left behind and spoiled. Personal belongings remained. The family dogs were found wandering the neighborhood, confused, alive, but alone. There were no packed suitcases, no obvious signs of preparation for a long journey, no blood, no forced entry. Just absence. Psychologically, this is where the mind fractures. When evidence suggests both normalcy and disaster at the same time, people fill in the blanks with assumptions. And in this case, the assumption that took hold early was a powerful one. Maybe the family left voluntarily. Maybe they crossed into Mexico. Maybe Joseph had financial troubles and needed to disappear. Maybe Summer agreed. Maybe the children were taken on an unplanned adventure. These maybes became the foundation of the investigation. Border surveillance footage surfaced showing a family resembling the McStays walking into Mexico. The figures were distant, grainy, unclear, but the image was enough. It fit the theory, and once a theory takes hold, it shapes everything that follows. The case slowed. Years passed. And psychologically, the most dangerous thing that can happen in an investigation happened here. Certainty replaced curiosity. While the world assumed the McStays had chosen a new life, something else was happening. Time was erasing traces. Memories were fading. Evidence was aging. Whatever truth existed was sinking deeper into the past. But disappearance does not erase reality. It only delays it. Behind the scenes, there were fractures that did not match the voluntary disappearance narrative. Financial records showed activity that raised questions. Business disputes existed. Trust had been tested. Joseph's company had problems, not catastrophic, but serious enough to create tension. And tension, when mixed with money and proximity, is one of the most dangerous psychological combinations known in criminal behavior. 3 years passed. 3 years where the McStay family existed only as speculation. Then in the Mojave Desert, silence broke. In an isolated stretch of land, human remains were discovered in shallow graves. The location was remote, harsh, and unforgiving, the kind of place chosen not for beauty, but for concealment. When forensic testing confirmed the identities, the illusion collapsed. The McStays had not started a new life. They had been erased from the one they had. The discovery reframed everything. The home was no longer abandoned. It was a crime scene missed in time. The border footage was no longer a lead, it was a distraction. The disappearance was no longer a mystery of choice, but of violence. And when investigators looked back through Joseph McStay's life, one name resurfaced with unsettling frequency. A business associate, a man with access, a man with motive, a man who knew the rhythms of Joseph's life. Charles Chase Merritt. From a psychological perspective, betrayal is often closer than danger from strangers. The human mind lowers its defenses around familiarity. Trust creates opportunity, and opportunity in the wrong hands becomes weaponized. As investigators dug deeper, they began reconstructing not just timelines but relationships, financial records, transactions, patterns of behavior. The case was no longer about where the McStays went, it was about who benefited when they disappeared. And slowly, the silence that surrounded the McStay family began to speak. Not loudly, but clearly. If you're finding this case as chilling as we are, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit the subscribe button. Dark Psyche Case Files dives into the psychology behind real crimes, because understanding the mind is often the key to understanding the crime. This was only the beginning. The truth, buried for years, was just starting to surface. The human mind clings to familiarity, especially when reality becomes unbearable. Once investigators accepted the idea that the McStay family had left on their own, everything that followed was filtered through that belief. Psychology calls this confirmation bias, the tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms what we already think is true. In this case, it delayed justice. While the public imagined the McStays starting over somewhere beyond the border, the reality was far less hopeful. Inside Joseph McStay's business life were fractures that never made headlines, disputes over money, questions about trust, strained partnerships that existed quietly, away from social media and public view. Joseph was known to be meticulous. He documented things, he kept records. People who knew him described him as careful, especially with finances. That made certain transactions after his disappearance deeply unsettling. Money began to move. Large withdrawals appeared. Checks were written from Joseph's accounts after he was already gone. Someone knew the passwords. Someone knew the systems. Someone understood how to move unnoticed, at least at first. This is where Charles Chase Merritt moved from background figure to central focus. Merritt was not a stranger. He was a business associate, a contractor who worked closely with Joseph's fountain company. He had access not just to the business but to Joseph himself. He knew schedules, he knew habits, he knew pressure points. Psychologically, crimes involving acquaintances are rarely impulsive. They are built slowly. Grievances accumulate. Justifications form. In the mind of the offender, harm becomes rationalized long before it becomes real. Investigators would later argue that Merritt was under significant financial stress. Gambling debts, personal money problems, a lifestyle that no longer matched his income. And then there was Joseph, a man who controlled payments, who questioned expenses, who represented both opportunity and obstacle. When someone under pressure sees another person as the solution to their problem, morality becomes negotiable. Digital evidence began to tell a story that words never could. Phone records, location data, computer usage. Merritt's phone activity placed him in areas that aligned too closely with key moments surrounding the disappearance. His explanations shifted over time, not dramatically, subtly. The kind of inconsistencies that emerge when someone is managing a story rather than recalling truth. But even with mounting suspicion, the case moved slowly. 3 years is a long time in a murder investigation. Evidence degrades, witnesses forget, alibis harden, and psychologically distance creates doubt, even when doubt is no longer warranted. Then came the discovery in the desert. The Mojave is vast, empty, unforgiving. It is a place where sound travels far and help does not. Choosing such a location is not accidental. It suggests planning, familiarity, a belief that isolation equals safety. Forensic analysis confirmed what families dread most. The remains belonged to Joseph, Summer, and their 2 children. The timeline shifted violently backward. The McStays had been gone for far longer than anyone wanted to accept. Investigators now had a truth that could no longer be ignored. This was not disappearance. This was elimination. With the confirmation of homicide, the psychological lens sharpened. The question was no longer where did they go, it was who wanted them gone. Financial records showed Merritt continued using Joseph's accounts after the family vanished. Transactions occurred at times when Joseph could not have authorized them. The defense would later argue coincidence, access sharing, confusion. But psychology teaches us that repeated coincidence is rarely coincidence at all. Patterns matter. Prosecutors began building a narrative of motive rooted in money and resentment. They argued that Merritt killed the McStay family to gain financial control and eliminate a business dispute. They pointed to his knowledge of the desert, his familiarity with the family, his opportunity. The defense countered with doubt. No direct witnesses, no confession, no murder weapon conclusively tied. They argued the case was circumstantial, a dangerous word in the courtroom but one that often defines real-world crime. What jurors were asked to do was not simply evaluate evidence, but reconstruct intent, to step inside the psychology of someone accused of erasing an entire family. And that is never easy. As the trial approached, the emotional weight intensified. 4 lives, 2 of them children, years of silence, a family that never had a chance to explain, defend, or escape. The courtroom became a space not just of law but of narrative warfare. 2 stories, 1 truth, and a jury tasked with deciding which reality made sense. If you're following this case and want more deep dives like this, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. Dark Psyche Case Files explores not just what happened, but why the human mind allows it to happen. In the next chapter, the trial itself would unfold. Every transaction examined, every movement dissected, every psychological crack exposed under scrutiny. And the question would no longer be whether the McStays were murdered. The question would be whether the evidence was enough to name the mind behind it. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the McStay family had already been gone for nearly a decade. Time had done what time always does in cases like this. It blurred memories, hardened opinions, and turned human lives into evidence exhibits. Yet psychologically, the passage of time did not weaken the emotional weight of the case. It intensified it. 4 people had vanished from their lives without warning. 2 of them were children who never reached an age where the world could explain itself to them. That reality hovered over the courtroom like an unspoken presence. Trials are not just legal proceedings. They are performances of logic versus emotion. And in this case, the prosecution understood something crucial. They did not need to prove how every moment unfolded. They needed to prove why it made sense. The state's narrative was built slowly, methodically, brick by brick. It began with motive. because the human mind always wants a reason. Random violence is terrifying, but purposeful violence is understandable, even when it is unforgivable. Prosecutors argued that Charles Chase Merritt was under mounting financial pressure in the months leading up to the disappearance. Gambling losses, debt, a reliance on Joseph McStay's business payments to stay afloat, and then came conflict, disagreements over money, accusations of mismanagement, the threat of being cut off. In psychological terms, this is where desperation can become distortion. When someone believes their survival depends on another person, that person can quickly shift from partner to enemy. Jurors were shown bank records, withdrawals, checks, transfers that occurred after Joseph and his family were already gone. The implication was simple and chilling. Someone was still using Joseph's financial identity. Passwords do not enter themselves. Then came the digital trail. Phone records placed Merritt in locations that aligned with key moments in the case. Cell tower pings are not precise memories, but they are consistent witnesses. They do not forget. They do not reinterpret events. They simply exist. The defense challenged everything. They questioned the reliability of location data. They suggested Joseph shared access willingly. They implied alternative suspects, shadow figures never fully defined. Their strategy relied on uncertainty, because uncertainty creates doubt, and doubt can free a defendant. But psychologically, doubt has limits. When too many loose ends point in one direction, the mind begins to resist alternative explanations. The prosecution emphasized behavior, Merritt's shifting statements, his nervous energy, his inability to offer consistent explanations for financial activity. In criminal psychology, inconsistency does not automatically equal guilt, but consistency under pressure often signals truth. The defense pushed back hard. They reminded jurors that there was no confession, no eyewitness, no single piece of evidence that showed Merritt committing the act itself. They argued that the case was built on interpretation rather than certainty. And that argument landed because jurors are human, and humans are cautious when asked to judge another human, fate. But then came the most difficult element of the case. The children. Prosecutors did not dwell on them. They did not dramatize. They did not exploit. Instead, they acknowledged something quietly devastating, that whoever killed Joseph and Summer did not stop there. From a psychological standpoint, crimes involving children collapse most defenses. It is one thing to rationalize violence between adults. It is another to accept harm done to those who could not possibly pose a threat. The implication was unavoidable. This was not an accident, not a moment of rage gone wrong. This was total erasure. As weeks passed, jurors were asked to absorb thousands of details: financial charts, expert testimony, maps of the Mojave Desert, explanations of burial sites without sensationalism. Each piece added weight, not shock, weight. And slowly, the narrative solidified. The idea that the McStay family had vanished voluntarily no longer fit the evidence. The idea that someone else committed the crime without Merritt's involvement required too many assumptions, too many coincidences, too much faith in chaos. Psychologically, the jury faced a moral tension. Circumstantial evidence is powerful when it converges, but it requires trust that patterns reflect intent, not chance. Closing arguments brought everything back to the beginning. A family that trusted someone close, a business relationship poisoned by money, a silence that lasted years because the truth was buried far from sight. The defense made one final appeal to doubt. They reminded jurors that life without parole, or worse, was irreversible. They urged restraint, skepticism, mercy. The prosecution asked jurors to consider not just what could have happened, but what most logically did. And then the jury deliberated. Behind closed doors, away from cameras and commentary, 12 people weighed one of the heaviest decisions a society can ask of its citizens. Not whether a crime was tragic, but whether the mind behind it had been identified correctly. When the verdict came, it was clear: guilty on all counts. Charles Chase Merritt was convicted of the murders of Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, Johnny McStay, and Joseph McStay Jr. The courtroom absorbed the moment quietly. No cheers, no relief that felt complete, because even justice, when it comes this late, cannot undo what was lost. And yet something shifted. The silence that began this case no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to memory. If you're still with us, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Dark Psyche Case Files exists to explore the psychological truths behind real crimes, not for spectacle, but for understanding. In the next chapter, we will explore the sentencing, the aftermath, and the lingering questions that continue to surround this case. Because even verdicts do not always bring closure. A verdict ends a trial, but it does not end a story. Psychologically, conviction is not closure, it is transition. The human mind does not simply accept loss because a courtroom assigns responsibility. Instead, it begins a quieter, heavier process: meaning-making. After the guilty verdicts were read, the focus shifted from proof to consequence. Sentencing is where the abstract becomes permanent, where words turn into years, where a legal decision becomes a lived reality for everyone involved. For the McStay family's relatives, the courtroom became a place of unresolved grief. There was no opportunity for goodbyes, no last memories untouched by violence, only the knowledge that the family had been gone for years while the world moved on, unaware. Victim impact statements were delivered with restraint, not because the pain was small, but because it was vast. Psychologically, immense grief often does not shout. It compresses. It speaks in controlled sentences because breaking down would mean never stopping. They spoke of absence, empty holidays, children who never grew older, questions that would never be answered, not by the defendant, not by the court, not by time. The prosecution argued for the harshest possible sentence. They emphasized premeditation, the scope of harm, the complete destruction of a family unit. They reminded the court that this was not a single life taken in a moment of rage, but 4 lives erased in an act that required planning, opportunity, and follow-through. From a psychological standpoint, sentencing is where society draws its boundary. It is where we collectively decide what behavior exists beyond forgiveness. The defense asked for mercy. They cited the lack of direct physical evidence. They argued that circumstantial cases, no matter how compelling, should be punished cautiously. They asked the court to consider the defendant as a human being, not just as a symbol of the crime. This is always uncomfortable, because both arguments can be true at the same time. The judge listened, carefully, methodically, and then delivered a sentence that reflected the gravity of the crime. Charles Chase Merritt was sentenced to death. Later, due to changes in California's application of capital punishment, the sentence was converted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But psychologically, the message remained the same: this individual would never return to society. For some, the sentence brought relief. For others, it brought nothing at all. Because punishment does not restore childhoods, it does not refill rooms with laughter, it does not undo years of not knowing. In the aftermath, the McStay case became a cautionary tale about assumptions, about investigative blind spots, about how easily a narrative can mislead even trained professionals when it feels comfortable. The early belief that the family had left voluntarily haunted the case. It delayed urgency. It softened response. It created space for evidence to disappear into time. From a psychological perspective, this is one of the most unsettling elements of the story. Not the crime itself, but how long it took to acknowledge that something was wrong. The border footage that once seemed so convincing was eventually dismissed as unrelated. The resemblance was coincidental. The timing did not align. But by the time clarity arrived, years had already been lost. The case raised difficult questions for law enforcement and the public alike. How often do we accept simple explanations because they allow us to avoid confronting darker ones? How many cases remain unsolved not because the truth is hidden, but because it is inconvenient? The McStay family's story also became a reminder of how crimes involving trust are often the hardest to detect. Danger does not always come from shadows. Sometimes it sits across from you in business meetings. Sometimes it shares access. Sometimes it knows your routines better than strangers ever could. Psychologically, betrayal alters the way survivors see the world. It fractures basic assumptions about safety and predictability. It teaches the mind that familiarity is not protection. In documentaries, this case is often summarized as a business dispute gone deadly. But that framing is incomplete. At its core, this was a case about perception, about how people are seen, how intentions are misunderstood, and how silence can masquerade as choice. Even after conviction, questions lingered. Why did it happen exactly when it did? Were there warning signs missed by those closest? Could intervention have changed the outcome? These questions have no answers that satisfy. And perhaps they never will. What remains is a psychological footprint, a case that reminds us that the most terrifying crimes are not always dramatic in the moment. They are quiet, calculated, and patient. If you're finding this analysis meaningful, remember to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Dark Psyche Case Files is dedicated to exploring the human mind behind real crimes, not to sensationalize, but to understand. In the final chapter, we will step back from the courtroom and examine the lasting impact of the McStay case on investigative psychology, on public trust, and on how disappearance itself is understood. When a case ends, the public often expects a sense of completion. A verdict is read, a sentence is given, headlines move on. But psychologically, some stories do not end, they settle. They remain suspended in the collective mind, resurfacing whenever a similar silence appears somewhere else. The McStay family became one of those stories. Long after the courtroom emptied, the case continued to echo through discussions about missing persons, investigative bias, and the dangerous comfort of assumptions. Because this was not only a case about murder, it was a case about how easily disappearance can be misunderstood. From a psychological standpoint, disappearance is uniquely destabilizing. Death, while devastating, offers certainty. Disappearance offers hope, and hope can be misleading. It keeps questions alive. It delays grief. It creates space for narratives that feel safer than the truth. In the McStay case, hope took the form of a belief that the family had chosen to leave. That belief was not cruel. It was human. It allowed friends, relatives, and even investigators to imagine the children alive somewhere, growing, laughing, adapting to a new life. But that belief also softened urgency. And urgency is often the difference between discovery and delay. Looking back, the warning signs seem clearer. A devoted mother unlikely to cut contact. Young children removed from routines without trace. A business owner with unresolved disputes. Financial activity continuing after silence. Dogs left behind. Food spoiling. These were not the actions of a family planning a new beginning. Yet psychology teaches us that clarity is easiest in hindsight. In real time, people cling to explanations that reduce emotional pain. Voluntary disappearance is less frightening than betrayal, less disturbing than the idea that someone close could erase an entire family. The conviction of Charles Chase Merritt answered the legal question of responsibility, but it did not answer every psychological one. The mind still asks why trust failed, why warning signs went unnoticed, why years passed before certainty arrived. For the McStay relatives, life moved forward unevenly. Grief does not follow a straight line, especially when it is delayed by years of uncertainty. There was no single moment of loss. There were many: the disappearance, the discovery, the trial, the verdict. Each stage reopened wounds in a different way. In the broader true crime landscape, the McStay case shifted conversations. Investigators began re-examining how quickly voluntary disappearance is assumed. Analysts question how much weight should be placed on ambiguous footage or partial narratives. Psychologists emphasize the importance of family behavior patterns over surface-level explanations. This case became a reminder that silence is not evidence of choice. It is often evidence of harm. There is also an uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story, one that challenges the way we instinctively categorize danger. The McStay family did not encounter a stranger in a dark alley. They encountered someone familiar, someone embedded in their professional life, someone trusted. Psychologically, this is the most difficult threat to accept, because it means safety cannot always be measured by proximity or history. It means risk can exist inside routine. And that realization changes how people see the world. For viewers, listeners, and readers, the McStay case lingers because it forces reflection, not just on crime but on perception, on how quickly narratives form, on how easily the mind fills gaps with comfort instead of caution. In true crime, it is tempting to focus on villains and verdicts, but Dark Psyche Case Files exists to go deeper, to examine the mental landscapes that allow crimes to unfold unnoticed, and the cognitive shortcuts that delay truth. The McStay family deserved more than years of speculation. They deserved urgency. They deserved protection. They deserved to be believed before the evidence was forced to speak for them. Their story now exists as a warning and a lesson. That disappearance should always be treated as a question, not an answer. That familiarity should never replace vigilance. And that silence, when it arrives suddenly, should never be ignored. If this case affected you, take a moment to like this video, leave a thoughtful comment, and hit the subscribe button. Dark Psyche Case Files continues to explore real cases through a psychological lens, not for shock, but for understanding. Because the mind behind the crime is often the key to preventing the next one. This has been the McStay family case. And some silences, once broken, should never be forgotten.